So thank you for this invitation to discuss about how it is really possible to share concepts and practices. In international cooperation processes, we need to inquire to better understand the interactions between international, national, and local levels. Okay. My presentation is about the French specific way of dealing with the Charter of Venice, and in particular is about an inaugural event, the meeting organized by ICOMOS France in 1976 in response to a request by ICOMOS International Executive Committee, which asked each section to give their thoughts on updating the Charter. An important aspect of my research work focuses on the relation between discourse and practice in heritage conservation with a comparative approach, and mostly between France and Italy. So this moment is very interesting because to try to understand what happens to a text when he is introduced in a specific context. And this is a very stimulating subject, in particular in France, where the document remained confidential for more than a decade after the Venice Congress. The aim of my presentation is to reconsider temporal aspects in the dissemination of principles formulated by a restricted international group of actors, and to analyze the conditions governing a transition from institutional adoption to a national level real familiarity with the document, and including the results of this domestication, we can say. French were always well represented in the major meetings, Athens, Paris, and Venice. Members of the administration, architects involved in the restoration, they took a key role in the international networks, as Claudine explained this morning, in accord with the tradition of French cultural diplomacy. So the role of France was always very important. Why, even if French representatives are actively present in the group that sought to amplify a transnational approach for heritage, why for France the charter drafted in Venice was not really shared until 1976? There are multiple interlocking phenomena that may explain why the Charter remained a niche document for a long time in France. I can say that no commentary on the Charter was published for more than a decade. The Venice Charter, we can point three aspects that must be pointed out. Although the Charter's articles were drafted in French, which was the lingua franca of international meetings until the middle part of the 20th century, some concepts did not come directly from ideas developed in France. At the 1976 meeting, many speakers emphasized the distance between specific concepts in the article and French intellectual approaches to build heritage. Also, the format of the document, structured in articles as normative document, appears to be an obstacle. French experts did not see any need to draft a set of common guidelines until the 1957 meetings in Paris, and they continue to express doubts about the usefulness of any specific rules at the Paris meeting in 1976. The opposite situation can be observed in Italy and Belgium, the two other countries to be represented in the small drafting groups in Venice in 1964. Another important thing is that the mid of 1960s in France, the conservation sector was engaged in significant innovation that responded to new approaches and new risks: uncontrolled urbanization, demolition of historic centers, destruction of landscapes. So I'm talking about the secteur sauvegardé, the important new politics, followed by experimental interventions in the first operational blocks, and the important reform of the Caisse nationale des monuments historiques, which modernized the management of the state-owned monuments. But what were the conditions that finally enabled the adoption, the domestication of the Venice Charter and turned it into the most frequently cited reference document in restoration-related debates in France? Creating a structure for ICOMOS was a complex process. It took time to assemble the human resources and to clarify the positioning within an institutional environment. Of commitment to cultural policy in Europe, institution in which French has been a driving force was fundamental. The French section had been organized as an association in 1973. The launch of the European Architectural Heritage Year, scheduled for 1975 by the Council of Europe, was an opportunity to promote and develop the expertise assembled. The European Charter of the Architectural Heritage, adopted by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe the same year, highlighting the need for joint action, have likely led to promote experts' involvement in the process of sharing common principles. So, newly bolstered by being anchored at national and European level, the French section responded to the invitation of the ICOMOS Executive Committee. The Paris Symposium was the result of this response. French experts made long presentations to an audience of professionals. It was mainly a French gathering, even if ICOMOS members from other countries were invited. And the symposium proceeding was published in a special issue of the journal Monuments Historiques. Who is this collection of commentaries designed for? The special issue is somewhere between an internal administrative report and a book intended for a wider readership. I have to say that none of the contributions are the result of scholar research. So now I have some observation on prevailing attitudes based on the author's profiles. We can start with non-architects. Art historians and General Inspector François Hainaut gives a critical documentary appraisal on pictorial works. His use of the concept of criticism indicates a familiarity with the international debates in a specific field of restoration. Hainaut's attitude shows that the sharing of common principles is already established in painted work field. The historian acts like a ferryman, carrying practices and knowledge. He introduced vocabulary specific to the realm of painting, such as the term lacuna of reversibility. As in other national contexts, through a process of transfer, the notions of lacuna and reversibility would finally be associated with the Venice Charter, even though they do not figure in either the preamble or the articles. The participation of two art historians, François Hainaut and André Chastel, and the paleographic archivist, Jean-Pierre Bablon, represent a significant development in opening up the debate. Jean-Pierre Bablon warns against the improper use of archival documents. His contribution shows how an expression like authentic documents, Article 9, may be differently interpreted depending on the knowledge mobilized. Chastel, Hainaut, and Bablon text consolidates the status of historical studies and documentation, opening to the official decision in 1985 in France to make preliminary studies mandatory in the planning of restoration campaigns. Their presence marked a turning point in the role of historical disciplines in this kind of meeting. What about our other senior officials like administrators of monuments or other institutions? Their relationship to the Charter appears as primarily geared to questions of management and ethical matters. Pierre Dussol, developing financial aspects, mentioned mentions a general respect of the Charter principle in French restoration works. But he reported one notable exception, the treatment of missing elements that have been replaced or reconstructed. He affirms that the practice is to do the best to make difficult to recognize any new element. By emphasizing this practice, he asserts the legitimacy to adopt the Charter without adhering to everything contained in its article. A bolder standpoint is the position of Jacques Houlet, who expressed major reservations about the Charter theoretical approach applied to the old city centers. He criticized the stellar theoretical viewpoint of the Venice Charter, I quote, describing concrete examples. Houlet maintains a radical hierarchical system that would distinguish between historic monuments and vernacular architecture. And now, what about architects? They brought in complementary approaches. Yves Boiret, developing the topic restoration and uses, is an example of consensus-based presentation. This kind of observations on inappropriate use have enabled experts in international bodies to come together around shared objectives. Other reports developed topics on which opinion was divided. Bernard Monet uses the term legibility derived from painted works restoration field to open up debate on a number of situations. The result of extra work, Article 9, replacements of missing parts, Article 12, and also should always be recognizable, Article 15. In doing this, he offers a new range of solutions that architects can put forward without rejecting the firmly established methods of mimetic integration, often favored in France. The debate surrounding the Charter played a significant role in promoting the acceptance of contrasting effects. In the late 1970s, contemporary extensions spread to old buildings in France. In France, and probably elsewhere too, interpreting the Charter's articles stimulated creative design that go behind the objectives of the document, and thus helped by ICOMOS demand to think about the Venice Charter. The text Problème de restauration by Froidevaux is a particularly telling example of the extreme difficulty of aligning a restoration project with the Venice Charter taken as a whole. Froidevaux presents 3 projects for which he is the best known: substantial restoration of churches severely damaged during World War II. Before showing this large range of reconstruction choices, he affirms his mistrust of, I quote, doctrines that are dogmatically maintained and often exclusive, implied the Venice Charter. In debate reported, the head of the National Monument Inspectorate in Budapest expresses a reverse interpretation of the same 3 projects. They testify for him the effectiveness of the Venice Charter. And what about Jean Saunier, the French architect most directly associated with the drafting of the document? Despite this, he doesn't act as a mediator. Saunier proposed an open, reflective approach that did not set out to define restrictive common principles. The case of Ganagobi Abbey, for example, is an illustration of an expanded interpretation of the concept of reassembling deriving from the Article 15. Here, Saunier shows a way to overcome constraints which he considers unnecessary by invoking value creation objectives. At the 1976 symposium, architects seized upon the Charter as a means to bolster their arguments and expand the range of options. This commenting exercise gave new depth to the collective thinking. The Venice Charter is a starting point for expanding the debate. I have explained this, but there are 2 texts more important in the proceedings. Michel Perron General Inspector, presented a long paper highlighting the ambiguities contained in the document. The author developed his own categories, like long-term or formal transparency, and these categories would not find the critical favor the author had hoped for, but his remarks on the societal challenges and the effect of opening up the debate to other disciplines was very important. The final text, Restauration et avenir du patrimoine, was authored by art historian André Chastel. He is the only contributor talking about Ruskin, Deyo, Dvorak, and Rigel. The contribution laid to the groundwork for a history of concept of heritage, patrimoine, and he published with Bablon La notion de patrimoine that would become a reference book in France. The various ways of engaging with the articles tell us about the various positions according to the skills and the roles of the actors. The proceedings also inform us about the genealogy of certain clichés, an inevitable opposition between the Charter's application and the economic viability, a conflict between the pragmatism of architects and historical rigor. The Charter began to carry out in France its role of common frame for mediation between actors who did not share the same knowledge or practices. The 1976 meeting encouraged the cross-fertilization of disciplinary approaches on the basis of novel ways and means. We can say that the document implicitly disseminated models of knowledge that would promote significant developments such as the affirmation of the status of historical studies. The text seems to operate as a boundary object, as introduced by Susan Leigh-Starr and James Grasmere in 1989, like this concept, a boundary object whose interpretative flexibility enables broad adherence without prior consensus. Making reference to the Charter, whether in order to invoke it or to put it up for discussion, becomes an expression of commitment to a shared goal set on another level, that of defending a common heritage in jeopardy and whose defense requires gathering all forces. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Houbart. Merci, Monsieur le Président. I speak of the revision of the restoration theory, the role of Italian ICOMOS committee. The ICOMOS scientific committees in many countries, including Italy, have in recent years begun a profound revision of the ideas either too prevalent in the field of the theory of and the philosophy of restoration, both architectural and archaeological. In particular, attention has been increasingly focused on the aspect of the material reality of architectural and archaeological artifacts, overcoming the still idealistic conception that prioritized figurativeness and aesthetic aspects. The idealistic visions follow philosophical concepts such as those dominant in Italy for much of the 20th century, according to the ideas of the well-known Abruzzese philosopher Benedetto Croce, who, harshly criticizing historical materialism, referred to Hegelian spiritualism. But the time of knowledge has always been considered essential for a correct approach to restoration operation. Indeed, freely interpreting a concept expressed by John Dewey, it is to be believed that one can speak of art, architecture, or archaeology only after an experienced knowledge of them. It can therefore be well affirmed that moving from an idealistic to a programmatic vision of reality, especially in the field of restoration, the basis of the recognition and knowledge of the architectural works is to be set in the construction site, understood not only as the place where the art de bâtir is practiced, but also as the place for the refinement of the ways of architectural knowledge. Precisely in Italy, increasing attention has been paid to the data of preventive knowledge of works to be restored, also through survey carried out with various methodologies, from the most advanced to the most innovative. The problems underlying such a new vision are linked to the difficulties and the resistance regarding the overcoming of consolidated theories, such as the related to Cesare Brandi, but which need to be profoundly updated. In particular, Brandi's ideas regarding the problem of maintaining or removing addition should be rediscussed, especially if must be decided which of the two needs, aesthetic or historical, shall prevail. These problems are encountered especially in confrontation with art historians who are still unaware of the importance of material data in the analysis of historical artifacts. Regarding the crisis that seems to grip various sciences today, even that of restoration, which remain a science even if applied to architecture or archaeology, seems to suffer from an almost sense of powerlessness. It is therefore a matter of overcoming an obstacle for an update of restoration theory through continuous dialogue and research. In the Italian ICOMOS, many committees and subcommittees are acting dynamically with specific reflection on restoration themes. The Italian scientific committees are grouped into 7 large thematic areas. In Area 1, the Italian Committee of TheoPhilos, for example, has given relevance to a time that might apparently seem unrelated, namely diagnostic. But instead, it must be considered that diagnostic, broadly understood, raises theoretical and methodological questions, both in itself and in the ways it is used or can be used for cognitive and interpretative purpose, but also in a planning and management perspective. And in this sense, it connects to the important contribution of ICOMOS International of the theme of diagnostic and restoration, which is represented by the document European Quality Principles for Intervention, founded by the European Union with potential impact on cultural heritage, developed and elaborated in the year 2018. In fact, precisely regarding restoration, it is also necessary that in the legislative and the programmatic level, the various countries ensure that every intervention is supported by a rigorous campaign of preventive, analytical, and diagnostic studies, in the design and the construction phase, and that, therefore, adequate economic resources are allocated to make it possible also at the level of tenders and specification. In Area 4, the Scientific Committee on Vernacular Rural Architecture has reawakened attention to vernacular architecture, also with conference and the publication with representatives from Italy and abroad, also involving the International Committee of Vernacular Architecture, even before special National Plan of Reconstruction funds were allocated. Work has also been done on the digitalization of rural heritage, bringing the Italian experience to the Istanbul Conference, Cities in Evolution, Diachronic Transformation of Urban and Rural Settlement, Istanbul 2021, and to China from the Silk Road Conference. In this sense, the Italian Committee on Cultural Landscapes made the consideration not far from those of TheoPhilos. Even in the case of landscape restoration, the same principles that underpin restoration in general should apply, albeit adapted to the scale and the complexity of the landscape, and include recognizability, maintaining the historical structure, minimum intervention, avoiding radical change and acting only when necessary, reversibility, ensuring that change can be undone, compatibility, using materials and technique compatible with the existing ecosystem, and interdisciplinarity, involving experts from different disciplines. In conclusion, new and dynamic ideas emerge from each of these subcommittees, contributing significantly to an update of thinking on the link between knowledge, conservation, design, and restoration. And then, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Please stay there for the possible questions at the end of the session. Now we will have a small permutation between the two last speakers, so Dimitrios has time to arrive before starting his presentation. So we will now listen to Lukasz Sadowski from Poland.
So one more time, good afternoon, and mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais exprimer quelques mots de remerciements dans la langue de nos hôtes. Donc, au nom d'Aleksandra et mon nom propre, merci d'avoir accepté notre texte. C'est vraiment un plaisir et l'honneur pour moi d'être ici. Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, the text and presentation have two authors. Aleksandra Sumorok, she is, in my opinion, the best expert in architecture of this period in Poland. And me, myself, I'm here as a speaker. So also as a speaker, I would like to start with my personal story. Okay. I think it doesn't work to change the... There must be a suspense, a surprise. Okay, ça marche maintenant, merci. So first of all, as a speaker, I'd like to say my personal story. As a child, born and raised under the communist regime, I hated personally this building. This is the Palace of Science and Culture in Warsaw, in the heart of Warsaw, in the capital of Poland. And I hated this Soviet-style building in the heart of my capital. I always imagined when I was walking inside of these sumptuous interiors that this building would disappear after independence was regained. Okay, à droite. After the collapse of the communist system in 1991, a group of pupils from our partner Scottish secondary school in Glasgow came to my school on the exchange program. And during one-day trip to Warsaw, this group leader, a young history teacher, Glaswegian, reacted enthusiastically to only one object, this one. It wasn't the old town, nor the palaces or royal castle, but the Stalinist skyscraper in a Moscow style. Then, as a 17-year-old pupil, I realized for the very first time that maybe this is a valuable object interested for foreigners, and maybe it's a witness of the period, witness of the epoch. Talking about the social realistic monuments in Poland, it's a difficult matter. It's a difficult heritage. We write down in our text, but first of all, what is exactly the social realistic object? What is the style, if we can talk about style, the period, etc. All of these factors. The style was introduced officially as a dominant in 1949, but we have the earlier examples of social realistic style buildings in Poland. Also, this style ended officially in 1955-56, but we have the objects in those style built after that. So this is a very vast, open area of history of art. You can see the building from this period. They are absolutely different. You can see something which reminds Gothic style from northern Poland, from Gdańsk. We have very modern department store in Poznań, and we have, let's say, the vernacular style, mountain Highlander style in south of Poland. And everything in here is the architecture of the socialist realist period in Poland. Also interiors, NAFTA office building in Krakow is very modern, it's very contemporary. But on the right-hand side, you have the interiors of this hated palace, which is typical neoclassical. It's a very classical architecture. So also, according to the styles, it's totally different. We have a lot of typical buildings, thousands of buildings like a block of flats. Those are examples from my hometown, or typical schools which were designed and built in 1950s all over Poland. We have also the problem of modernization. In proper modernization, these buildings are usually more than 70 years old, so they need a proper conservation, and we have problems with materials, with the colors, with keeping the style, with keeping the original elements. I will extend this topic a little bit at the conclusion. Those buildings were constructed, let's say, in the late 40s and 1950s, and the first wave of critical revaluation of social realists architecture appeared during the thaw, which means in 1956. But the first listing to the list of national monuments appeared as early as in 1970s. The building of a Polish parliament, originally built in 19th century, then rebuilt before the World War II, destroyed and rebuilt in a social realistic style in 1940s, late 1940s, was listed in 1973, but not because it was a historical monument in those times, but because of its function. So it was nothing to do with a history of art, let's say the quality of architecture. It was listed because it was important, one of the most important buildings in Poland, and it was because of its function. The same like another example from my hometown. This is the Great Theater, which was actually completed as late as in 1967, and already in 1976 it was listed as a national monument because of its function, not because of the history of art or, let's say, architectural values. Another example is from the industrial, nowadays a post-industrial region, Silesia, the Palace of Culture, which was listed in 1979. Then in 1980s, we don't have examples of listing the objects as a national monument, but a kind of a surprising situation appeared in the city of Białystok. This is the capital of the region close to the Belarusian border in eastern Poland. And in 1990s, so after the collapse of communism, the local government decided to put on the list several buildings from new social realistic style center. And it was a kind of a single example in such a case in Poland in 1993 and in 1996. Those buildings were also listed. Then the situation changed and became, let's say, more official at the beginning of 21st century. And first of all, Kraków, Nowa Huta, which is another town built by communist regime next to Krakow. You can see the very interesting urban plan, which is, let's say, based on the St. Petersburg plan or any other later Soviet plans. Also, it refers to Plan de Versailles and even Rome, if we are talking about those three axes. And this was the first site, the first, let's say, a point of interest for historians of architecture, which caused the discussion and books and publications and articles about the social realistic architecture in Poland. So this case was, let's say, the first turn in the process of appreciation the social realistic as a something which is worth, according from the point of view of a historian of architecture. Then 2007, we're coming back to the same building because this is the most important monument of era. And 2007, it was listed as a monument. But in the same year, the Committee of Architecture and Urban Planning of the Polish Academy of Science wrote down that this building, in sense of its concept, is the denial of architectural rationality in all its economic, technical, aesthetic, and urban aspects. Also, till now, well, nowadays it's safe, let's say it's under the protection, but till now, a lot of politicians, not only from the far right, but also from the center, they think that this building should be demolished because it's a symbol of the Soviet occupation. Some other examples, this is also my hometown. This is the final tram stop, very modern, very contemporary type of architecture, which was listed in 2010. And nowadays it's got a perfect new function as the headquarters of the District Chamber of Architects. This is a place for intervention, for lectures, for exhibition. And it's one of the finest and well-cared examples of this architecture in my hometown. Another examples from the beginning of 21st century. So we can see that from 2004 onwards, all of the situation changed and many new buildings, I mean, the social realist buildings became national monuments. Some of them, according to the architecture, to the forms, are really unusual. This is one of my favorites, the observatory and planetarium, which is one of the finest examples of a mixture of a very contemporary architecture with some traditions. And another example from Gdańsk, and also one of my favorites, Palace of Culture, which refers to the residential architecture. This reminds our historians of art, the palace, the royal palace, the royal manor in Łazienki, which was out in the outskirts of Warsaw in the 18th century, with a very good, very classical architecture. And on the other hand, in the same city, Rzeszów, we have the, let's say, Lubianka style building, which was the office of the local government, but it's also listed as the monument in 2017. There were several problems with the whole district in the center of Warsaw, the Marszałkowska Street Residential District, which was finally listed after the third attempt in 2017. And it was the famous quotation from conservator of the monuments in Warsaw region who said, finally. It was the third attempt. There were a lot of opponents, but it's finally also on the list. And I told you about the Nowa Huta, the whole urban plan, which was listed as the first one in 2004. But finally, we have also objects, architectural objects. And you can see also the difference In Polish social realistic architecture, we have a lot of local elements. For example, those attics, which refers to the historical Renaissance style architecture of the region of Krakow. So it's also a kind of a very significant, very individual factor of this architecture. We cannot say that social realist architecture was the same, was based only on the Soviet pattern. And losses. Unfortunately, in the meantime, in the 21st century, in our contemporary times, we have some of the losses. The biggest one is the Leningrad cinema, which was designed in the historical heart of Gdańsk, the city, the port in northern Poland. And this is one of the most splendid examples, especially according to the interiors. And everything disappeared in 2016. There were a mass protests signing the lists, but unfortunately, one of the chain of the hotels, I don't know if I should tell the name, okay, Hampton by Hilton, they decided to leave only the facade. It was, of course, it was the building from 1950s. It was not the original part of the old district. I cannot say old town because it's not the proper name, but old district of Gdańsk. But it was cleaned inside, and also from the back wall there was a mosaic by Anna Fischer. And luckily, the local activist, well, it was not destroyed. It was taken off from the wall, and now it's in the special storage, waiting for the better future. But on this side, this is a historical photography because there is a back wall, the back part of the hotel nowadays. And another loss, it's a stadium. It was the main 10th anniversary stadium in Warsaw, which was replaced by this building before Euro 2012. And well, it's one of the most spectacular sport buildings in Poland nowadays. And only small part of decoration, like those sculptures, were saved, exposed in a special place, but the structure, the architecture, is totally new. And one more example, this building, it's a tourist house in mountain, in Zakopane region, in Carpathian Mountains. And nowadays it's a hotel. It was transformed into the hotel. It looks more or less the same, isn't it? But in fact, this building was changed. If you look at the roof, originally it was the biggest shingle roof in Poland. And nowadays it was replaced by metal roof tiles. Also, you can see the roof, you can see the angle, the curved angle, it's different. So this is the same building, but it's not the same. It's been changed. It's a kind of a historical falsification in this case. But those are the main losses. And nowadays we think how difficult is the heritage, how troublesome is the heritage. So first of all, there is a matter of choice and acceptance. And in general, this architecture is acceptable now, except some of the examples, except some of the voices, also from the politician. This architecture is acceptable as a historical monument. So people can appreciate that this is the monument with, let's say, 70 years old history. And we have, despite of that, new challenges for the protection, especially the transformation of modern cities. Most of the buildings are in the centers of the modern cities, so we have new challenges for conservation, and also the climate change, also the using of the materials which are not, let's say, enough for nowadays climate changes. We have some problems like a greenery. It was those districts, the social realistic districts, were designed with a area, a place for the greenery. And nowadays, very often the land, the part of those territories, areas, belongs to no one or belongs to the city. So we have the problem with overgrown lawns, self-seeding plants, etc. So those are some examples. You can see the architecture and you can see area between those blocks of flats, and it looks usually bad. Also, if we have a care about greening, we have a inappropriate greenery. For example, it's also an example from my hometown, scatter plants in pots, small islands of greenery surrounded by large paved surfaces. There was a big discussion in Poland about paved areas instead of greenery, and we do hope that it also will change the approach to the greenery also in those kind of districts. This is the old town, but in fact, this area, this district was totally reconstructed after the World War II because it was a Jewish district, Jewish ghetto. Most of the buildings were destroyed, and those which were not destroyed were replaced in the style, in the national social realistic style. Another problem, parking lots. So you have the splendid architecture listed as a monument. This is the example from MDM in Warsaw. But this monumental architecture, in fact, is surrounds the huge parking lots. And also the problem of increasing the density and expansion of existing facilities. This is Nowa Huta in Krakow. So the area under the protection, and this is the former canteen for workers, for labor workers, which is under the process of building the block of flat after the making the whole building, in fact, different function and different size. So this is also one of the problems. Another problem, quite important, is a problem of losses and degradation of detail. Unfortunately, another example from my hometown, when you can see the block of flats in a classical social realistic style with graffitos, which are partly lost already. And we are asking as a society of historian of arts, well, generally as a milieu of a historian of arts, to do something with that. And there is still not a proper response from the local authorities. And also another problem, which is quite common in Poland, insulation of the buildings, putting the new, let's say, layers of the styrofoam, yeah, it's a correct name, to put it on the wall, and we are losing the details. Of course, those are not very historical details, but it makes those buildings losing their own character. I don't want to say charm, but let's say the character of the buildings. And this is quite common in Poland nowadays. And it's always explained as the economical reason for protection of the heat in the cold buildings, in the cold interiors. But I think it's also the matter of improper care and awareness about those buildings. And also, there's a problem of disintegration of the urban tissue in general, lack of services, and the lack of good cooperation with the city authorities. Another example, with a building with the restaurant, which cannot properly be used as a restaurant because the land, the area next to it belongs to the city. I'm about to finish. And there is no cooperation, so there is no money for saving and protecting this building. Generally, the social realist heritage is no longer difficult, unwanted legacy. It has gained, as I mentioned before, public approval. Despite this, we have new challenges which continue to arise, and I show you those problems and problems in protection and maintenance of this kind of architecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Et merci de votre attention.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the last presentation of this session with Dimitrios from Greece.
Well, thank you very much. It was great to see you all here, both family and friends of the TheoPhilos committee. With the last presentation that focused, among other things, on installation, I will take a lead and now bring you to something that is really similar. But first, let us just remember where we were 1 year ago, just November 2024, in the first of our autumn conferences in Thessaloniki. Many of you were there, and it's great to see you again here. And of course, the TheoPhilos conference was not the only major event in Thessaloniki at that very weekend, because the city also celebrated its inauguration of the Central Underground Railway, the metro line, after 25 years of construction. Just to mention, Nigel, that it's now for 1 month out of operation due to repairs. Yes, due to return in December, if you wish to return to Thessaloniki. And of course, since TheoPhilos is always there at the most important events, there was also an inauguration committee that was set up to take part in the festivities. It was comprised of a certain world-known architect from the United Kingdom, our most gracious host here in Liège, and two fellows from Greece, one of whom is talking to you right now. So I mentioned the underground because a city, in order to function properly, needs its infrastructure. And likewise, a monument, in order to function properly and safely, needs its electromechanological installations. But where do you get when these installations become a huge, complicated bundle of wires, pipes, and cables? How do you fit them in? And do you actually risk distorting the very character and ambience of the monument that we wish to preserve? So I'm going to raise an argument about how to draw a certain methodology on this crucial issue in conjunction with the theoretical principles that ICOMOS has directly and mostly indirectly developed in its 60 years of existence, and all of this through 5 case studies that I happen to have personal experience with as director over the last year, and in previous years deputy director in the north of Greece with the center of Thessaloniki. Now, the theoretical framework, one could start from the Venice Charter, mentioning that everything in the course of reuse that is added needs to be distinct from the original composition and bear a contemporary stamp, a most modernist idea. There are certain subsequent charters which have actually stressed the concept that there should be a consistency of forms and materials, and from there on, we even have that building codes and other standards should be implemented in an adapted way, take Hertz dimensions into account, achieve reversibility, and in a whole phrase, achieve aesthetically compatible additions, interventions. So how does that come into practice? The first case study I'm going to talk to you about is this eclectic mansion in the eastern part of Thessaloniki. It was constructed in the early 20th century as the residence of a very wealthy family of the city. It became derelict in the 1970s, and in the mid-1980s, it was one of the first monuments in the city to be restored in what we would say, we would describe as a scientific manner. In this case, this was a time when the monuments like this one in Thessaloniki were daily facing the threat of demolition. This is a mansion of a similar date and form that lies merely 500 meters to the east, and it was already nearly torn apart, as you can see in the picture. So it was very important at this early stage of conservation in the city to highlight as much as possible the original aesthetics and their special value in the cityscape. So when it came to putting in all the necessary electromechanological installations, they knew that they had a complex maze of equipment to fit in the building, but they also wanted to highlight as much as possible its original form. And so what they did was that they concealed everything as much as possible. And even in the case of new fixtures, you can see here a picture of the central hall on the upper floor. The light fixture that was put at the very center, because the original did not exist, was designed in a way to resemble what would have stood there in the original mansion, of course, with modern parts, but still a clear effort to design something that you may actually mistake as part of the original building. And that effort culminated in the way they arranged the internal heating and cooling units, which was, in order not to make them visible in any way, there was a small recess below the windows, which are all clad with wooden paneling. So they removed the wooden paneling, and in that small recess, they accommodated the machines and put the cladding just 10 centimeters forward. So you had the result here on the right sketch, which means that when you walked inside the building, you really had no idea that there was a new machine hidden behind that paneling. Everything almost totally concealed. Now, approximately 10 years later, from the mid-1980s, in 1995, Thessaloniki was preparing for a major event, which was its inauguration as Cultural Capital of Europe for the year 1997. And at that time, many conservation works took place, and among them, many traditional houses were conserved. One of them was the one you see here in the picture, a very sizable example of local traditional architecture. Here, what they did in order to minimize, again, as much as possible, the interventions for accommodating the electromechanological equipment was from the very beginning to conceal again as much as possible, but also in the question of how to arrange the lavatories, because originally the toilet was in the courtyard, not inside the building. Instead of selecting a certain space, a room or a set of rooms in the building, and in that case, they would need to create holes and drill for pipes and cables and all the other equipment. What they did was that at the back of the, well, you can see it on the left drawing, at the back of the original building, they they dug the slope, the ground rise, and they created a new volume, which is totally invisible. And there they accommodated the lavatories and all the mechanological equipment that was required for their function, along with other parts that were required for the entire building. So here's the cross section where you can see the original building and, whoops, magic. Came to the end. Extreme speed. So you can see here how they added this new space, this new room inside the ground, so it's not to be visible, and all of that technology went into there, leaving rather intact the central original building volume. When it came for the visible fixtures that were of course required, like the light fixtures or the heating units, they decided this time not to conceal them. They decided that they would be visible, but in a very plain form, modern in design, but extremely plain. You can see here, for example, light fixtures that are like spheres, and also the very thin heating panels that were added on below the windows. You needed only a socket, and you plugged in, and this machine operated. There was no air conditioning, so no cooling for the summer. But the overall idea was that we want to conceal as much as possible, but in cases of fixtures that need to be visible, they will be visible, but in the most discreet manner possible. And this was a certain development from the 1980s because there was a huge increase in the number of specialized engineers that were now taking part in conservation, and also our service had also been there for about 15 years, so we had better control over the conservation works. Now, at the same time, again, in the course of the preparation for the Cultural Capital of Europe festivities, this is a warehouse in the port of Thessaloniki, which was initially in one single space in the interior, an open plan interior. In order to reuse it as an exhibition hall, what they did was that they added a gallery all around the perimeter of the building, leaving a central void, which had the original two-story high of the building. But in this case, what is very interesting is that they chose not to hide all the installations. To this end, the huge ducts that were required for the ventilation and the heating and air conditioning, they were not hidden in some wall or floor. They were actually visible by being inserted, as you can see them here, inside the roof structure and below the new modern gallery. And at the same time, they even dared add a glass elevator at the very center of the open area at the center of the building. Now, one may, of course, see a certain surprise compared to the previous example where they tried to be as discreet as possible. Here, they do to a certain extent, they become more visible. But I would also challenge that at this very building with this very industrial ambience, it does not fit, it does not seem to not to fit that this certain infrastructure was added in full alignment with the axis of the building and with a certain consistency in terms of material, because all the features were metal and glass, which are materials that originally existed in this structure. So you have a rather dynamic coexistence, which does fit in rather well. And at the same time, because you can also see these elements, you also have a more strong sense of reversibility. Now, again, approximately 10 years later and closer to our times, approximately in 2022, here we have what has become a trend in Thessaloniki. The city has attracted numerous foreign investors and many visitors and tourists over the last 10 years, particularly after the coronavirus containment. And this has led into an increase of the required hotel rooms and apartments for rent. So it is very popular at this point that buildings in the city, among them historic buildings, are being converted from single residences to separate apartments that are available for short or long renting. And this is a mid-war 1931 clinic, which later served as a residence. This is its original floor plan, where you can see a central corridor with rooms flanking the main aisle. And what they did was that they had to convert this, each separate space, into one apartment, which meant that originally you had one house with one bathroom. Now you would have 8 small houses with 8 separate bathrooms and kitchens, which means added pipework, cablework, wiring, plus heating, safety for fire, and vertical movement. And how did they do all that? Well, this is a typical room. The drawing shows the plan on the left. The major movement was that they put together as close as possible these amenities that required large-scale installation of electromechanical features. So you have the small kitchen right next to the bathroom. At the same time, right next to them, they also had vertical shafts, which means that you have a hole of a very small dimension at a particular specially selected place in the building. And so through that, you can have all the pipes and the cables and the wires that are required in order to have a proper accommodation. And something also that is interesting is that they selected that this nucleus of the kitchen and the lavatories had a lower height compared to the original ceiling, which is filled with plasterwork, so that you can have an idea that this is a modern addition. And they fixed the heating apparatus right on top of the roof of this new addition. So you also have a certain sense of responsibility and understanding of what is new and what is old. And as concerns the light fixtures, you can see that they went a bit further from the rather plain and strictly plain, actually, light fixtures that were selected in the 1990s. And coming to the latest development, I would say, this is a project that our service is currently supervising and is nearing completion. It is the conservation of the building of the State Conservatoire in the very historic center of Thessaloniki. This was a very complex and demanding function because it means that the students have to have very special conditions for studying with strict rules in terms of sound penetration, for example. In this instance, we had certain similarities with the previous project in the clinic, which is that we preferred to make vertical shafts at selected places of the building so that we can run through them all the complex cable work and pipe work that needs the building in order to operate properly. And at the same time, we even accommodated an elevator in a very conveniently sized subsidiary space near the main staircase of the building. The dimensions are original, and so we only had to insert the metal frame of the elevator. But what is most interesting in this case is that certain parts of the building, like the ground floor rooms, had very ornate interiors and ceilings. So when we went upwards, because the building had suffered many losses and destructions and reconstructions and repairs, what we observed was that the upper rooms had been renovated fairly recently, and there was no decorative whatever work on the ceilings, which were fully conventional. So that meant that we had the capacity to add a low-height suspended ceiling. In view of this benefit, what we actually did was that we transferred to the upper stories the uses that were more demanding in terms of electromechanical equipment, and we left the ground floor for the more neutral uses, as for example, the offices. So you understand how important it is to actually acknowledge the special qualities and characteristics of the building in order to come to a proper conclusion. And as a conclusion, and a certain, let's say, initial methodology that we could shape from the 5 case studies, I would first mention that we need the special values and characteristics of the monuments to be fully identified. And once identified, we need a skillful appreciation of these special values and characteristics, both separately and as a whole, what I would call the very ambience of the building, which ought to define compatible courses of action, compatibility being valued in terms of whether we achieve or not appropriate discreteness. And what do we mean by discreteness? If you are in an industrial setting, that will probably favor even some relaxed interventions, among them possibly a dynamic coexistence of old and new, but which will certainly require a certain consistency of materials and alignment with the layout of the original building. And from there on, if you are in a more eclectic and decorated interior, you will certainly need minimum interference. And to that end, for example, one could have the service areas arranged in close proximity, would also hide certain parts of the equipment in replastered walls or repaired floors, or even in vertical shafts at specific points in the structure. We could even have the insertion of elevators in conveniently sized spaces in the building, and the deployment of plain yet modern in terms of form visible fixtures. In 2 last words, what I would consider most important in this complex issue. Well, I think we need, number 1, accurate evaluation, and number 2, acute judgment. A certain degree of patience, which is what you have shown towards me in the last 15 minutes, and for which I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitrios. That's very interesting, these last examples, because yesterday we visited the Venice restored by Le Maire, and this question was really a very important question also in the course of the project, because all the houses were also divided into smaller units. So there was this problem of where do we put the radiators, how do we deal with the pipes and so on. So that's still a question, and it's an important one. So now we have time for questions.
Yes, I have a question for Franca. We have there, yes, we have talked about this actually earlier. Now, after seeing your presentation, I have more questions. So last year marks the completion of the partial reconstruction of the timber roof of the Notre Dame de Paris. And as a kind of thematic conference talking about the issues related with this reconstruction, in Tokyo, there was a conference organized for this, and for which 2 of the chief architects of the monuments of Notre Dame were invited there to really express their main arguments regarding this quite contested, I would say, project. And in this conference, the 2 of them, they claimed some quite challenging new ideas, including the concepts of so-called new authenticities. They think that the project of the partial reconstruction, of course, on the Notre Dame, created new authenticities, featuring the new social consensus or tastes of the French society. And they also think one of the main goals for the project is to keep a kind of stylistic harmony, to unify the styles and also to make it beautiful, which really resonates some ideas of Viaduc, for example. So what do you think about these kind of really recent claims in the sense of the French dissemination of the Venice Charter's main ideas? And do you think it's still, on the same course with 12 years, the first 12 years after the conference you mentioned, or are there some other new opinions, generally speaking, in France about this?
So thank you is not only a question, it's more than this, but what I can say is that I try to explain the special, I think, position of French specialist experts in front of the Venice Charter. So you have seen a sort of late reaction, so more than 12 years to even talk about. And we have to better understand the situation if we think that French is a special organization, so no classes on restoration in normal studies for architects, so 5 years without restoration classes, we can see, and mostly specialized schools, École de Chaillot, that is for a little number of persons that are after this architect du patrimoine and maybe architect en chef des monuments historiques. So a very centralized and very well structured organization. So is almost the same now, and really no very few publication, books, published debates about this kind of thing. So this is a special situation, and I tried to explain that with the Paris meeting in 1976 started a sort of French position in front of the charter. So in some way they are dealing with what is in the charter that is not so simple to deal with because there are so many different things. If you read the articles, there are some deontological propositions, something are very common sense recommendation, other things are more difficult to understand, and other things are really implied, implicit philosophy that it is not explained. So this is not so easy. And so French take what they think is good for one project, and for other they say we can give our interpretation. This is in the preamble, so they use it. So you can defend or are in with the Venice Charter because you think that everyone needs a document to yes, to dialogue, but that not means for French to not applied as you think is the better thing for the monument. So I think this is starting at this moment, is still continuing, but now it's different because in the 20th century, I can say more, everyone is quoting the charter without reading the charter. So a lot of different things they are talking about. They say, oh, like is written in the charter and there is nothing about in the charter. So now is more difficult. So Notre Dame is the more interesting subject about this because everything was said. One thing on the contrary, but everything is in the charter. So you can change La Flèche and do something new is in the charter. You do the same as Viollet-le-Duc is in the charter. You do something like Viollet-le-Duc, but better is in the charter. So this is the French way to deal with the charter.
Okay, other questions or remarks? No? And online, maybe? Well, if there aren't any questions, then we can have the coffee break for half an hour. And then after this coffee break, we will have the round table with our guests who are, 3 of them are online. 1 of them is with us, and it will be moderated by Geora, so don't miss it. But before that, maybe I would like to invite you to go quickly outside, breathe a little bit, and have a group picture, because maybe people won't be exactly the same today and tomorrow, so it's good to have one today, maybe one tomorrow, and it's still a little bit, well, it's not worse than earlier, so we'll do that. So for those who are online, we meet you again in half an hour.